Okay, so this is part one of the Kyosho Lazer ZX6 build series, and I finished what I would basically call the first module of the build, which comes down to mounting the front and rear inner hinge pin carriers for the front and rear of the chassis, as well as the front and rear gearboxes and the front bumper. So far, so good. It took me maybe 40 minutes to 45 minutes just to do this. I would say that it does require a fair bit of patience to get it right. And I will explain why. So, in the first step, what you have here is you're mounting the front rear inner hinge pin mount. Okay, so you have the actual mount itself, which is a particular part number. Now, the part itself is an aluminum part. Maybe hard to see here, change the lighting. It's an aluminum part. All the hinge pin mounts are aluminum, which is really cool. But the parts themselves don't have any labeling. So you really just have to go by the shape of the part and compare that to how it's drawn in the manual. And the front inner hinge pin mounts use, here, take these out. They use a different shape insert than the rear inner hinge pin mounts. So the front mounts are kind of a smaller ellipse than the rear inner hinge pin mount insert pieces. Okay, so that's one way to tell whether you have a front or rear part. And then each tree has A, B, C, D, E, up to E on the inserts for the front, and I think this goes out to F for the rear inserts. And basically, by using a different insert and mounting it one way or the other, you change the toe-in of the car. I don't know, it's kind of hard to tell by the location of the holes. It is possible, no, it doesn't change the anti-squat. That's with the shims. Okay, so this is basically changing your toe at the front and rear. I'm not entirely sure why you would need to use these kinds of inserts on the front inner hinge pin mount, because if you want to change the front toe-in, you can just do that by lengthening or shortening the actual steering arm lengths. But doing it that way, even though it technically works, you don't get, it's hard to get an exact measurement of toe-in when doing it through the steering arm lengths. You can use like a Huddy setup board, but those are, I have one, they're a real pain in the butt to use correctly. So this makes it actually a lot easier to make incremental adjustments in toe-in. So that's probably why they did it for the front inner hinge pin mounts. And then for the rear, of course, it's obvious you use this to adjust your rear forward traction. So that's how you adjust toe, and then to adjust kick up at the front or anti-squat in the rear, you have these little inserts, these plastic inserts that go between the hinge pin mount and the chassis. Now on the old ZX5, you would use these pieces here on this parts tree, and each piece has a different thickness. Is that right? Yes. Each one of these pieces is a slightly different thickness. And so by changing the thickness of that shim or spacer under the hinge pin mount, you're changing the relative height of the front and rear inner hinge pin mounts, and that changes your anti-squat at the rear or your kick up at the front. Okay? So the thing is, on the ZX6, you do use these parts, but only for the rear inner hinge pin mounts. For the front inner hinge pin mounts, you get a new set of parts trees for the upper gearbox case. And then on this end here, you have these two pairs of shims like this. And what's different about them is that the spacing between the holes, the mounting holes, is smaller than what it is on this part here. Okay, so if you're not careful, you can end up taking parts off of this tree and trying to use it on the front and fiddling around with it, only to find that it doesn't work because you actually have the wrong part. These holes here are too far apart to use at the front. You have to use the pieces on this parts tree. It's, here, I'll show you. I actually have some spares here. So this is what it looks like, okay? And there are no identifying markers like on the ZX5 parts. You have little notches at the end of the part, like 3, 4, 5 notches that indicates the thickness. Here you just have a piece. You just have to look at the side and measure it to actually measure out the thickness. So you get a thin piece that's, I think, 0.5 millimeter thick, and a thicker piece is 1 millimeter thick. You get a pair of each. So you're supposed to use the thin piece for both of the front units. And the thick pieces you just get to keep for yourself. Of course, the screw bags and everything else, it all comes as one big bag. This huge bag here has all these parts here, plus these parts, your suspension arms. It has a whole bunch of parts, the screw bags, the hinge pins, the ball studs, these parts trees, everything except this chassis. It's a separate parts bag, all in one bag. So you're going to be fishing around a bit for parts. I just took the screws and put them in a small tackle box. Should make it easier to organize. You will need metric calipers to measure out the screws. Makes it easier to figure out what you're using. So anyway, mounting the hinge pin mounts, make sure you just take your time with it to make sure you get it right, to make sure that you're using the right inserts and you're installing them correctly, because you can install them front side up or upside down. Make sure you have the orientation correct on both the left and right side of the car or of the piece. The other thing, oh right, because these are aluminum pieces, you have to make sure you use thread lock when mounting the screws, right? They're just standard screws, blah, 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 you screw them in. But because it's metal on metal, you got to use thread lock. And the manual does not mention thread lock. It does not remind you to use thread lock. It expects you to exhibit common sense in that case. So remember to use thread lock on those parts. Other notes about this sequence of steps: when you're actually mounting these hinge pin mounts, part of the challenge is balancing everything, because you have the hinge pin mount plus the spacer, so it's two parts that are floating around until you insert a screw and anchor it. But the screws have thread lock, right? You're putting some thread lock goop on it, so you have to find a way to hold the spacer and the mount down while with the onto the chassis and keeping all the holes aligned, while with the other hand getting the mounting screw up through the holes and starting to thread it in. So for each of these, that can be a challenge. It's a little bit easier when you mount one of these and then mount the arms and then mount the front, because you could at least try to use the hinge pins on the arms to kind of hold the other hinge pin mount in place and just slot the spacer in there and, you know, put the screw in. So it's a bit of a challenge. Just be patient with it. Take your time, and you'll eventually get there. It definitely takes more time than mounting arms on a Losi 22.4 or a B44 or a B5 or anything like that. The front bumper, kind of interestingly, it's small. I mean, most four-wheel drive buggies do not have large front bumpers, but there are no mounting screws on the bottom of the chassis. There's one mounting screw that goes through the front of the gearbox here, which is through the front inner hinge pin mount and then into the gearbox. So that's how you mount the front bumper. So if this piece snaps off, or if this plastic breaks here, this will pop off. But it's relatively thick. There's enough material there. It shouldn't be a problem. The added, I guess, feature of this is that this one screw also locks the front gearbox against the front inner hinge pin mount. So it's just an extra fifth screw to secure the lower gearbox in place. You have something very similar going on at the rear. There's no actual rear bumper, but you do have a screw that goes through the rear hinge pin mount into the rear gearbox case. Okay, so it's the same kind of idea. So that's where I am right now. Let me just kind of put this stuff away here. I'll keep going and we'll see how far I get tonight, and I'll do a little more tomorrow. Next step, and next series of steps, is building the ball diffs. That should be a little bit more straightforward than this. One thing I forgot to point out from the, if you even want to call it an unboxing video, the intro video, is a difference between the ZX5 and the ZX6 is the ZX6 has an aluminum lower chassis. The ZX5, I believe I mentioned, has an upper deck, which this doesn't have. That upper deck tended to break. It also had the lower deck as a molded plastic, and it was fairly strong, but it was also kind of brittle, especially at the front in this part here where the chassis started to taper in. That plastic chassis tended to break a lot around this region. There was a fix to that. You could buy an aluminum brace. It was made by some other company. I forgot the name. And that basically made the chassis almost impossible to break. But you don't have that problem here because this is aluminum. Although if there's the problem with using metal chassis is that they do tend to tweak over time. So you'll get bends and warps and whatever, and that'll change the car's behavior. With plastic, it's either functional or it's broken. So it's an advantage using plastic and carbon fiber for that matter. But the aluminum chassis, I don't expect to run this car too hard. Should be fine. And they do give you several different holes for later on when you play around with putting braces on the chassis. You can change, I believe, where you put those braces to change the chassis flex. So it's kind of a neat feature. Anyway, enough rambling. This is what I have right now. And I'll get to the diffs soon. So let's just turn the page here. Next step, ball diffs. Front and rear. Mount those. And then you do, let's see what else we got here. Then we start doing the shock towers, putting the ball diffs in, putting the gearbox cases on. So probably somewhere around either finishing the ball diffs or putting the shock towers on. I'll make a video around there. Okay, thanks for watching.